gorgeous little 2-month-old baby. And as those moms out there, dads out there, recall that with the babies at 2 months old, they're nursing multiple times a day. And as they're nursing, baby just lies there and looks at mom, and you can see her eyes scanning, from face, forehead to cheeks, and just looking around and curious and suckling. And whenever the eyes come across and meet mama's eyes, you see this just emotional response immediately, and maybe stopping nursing and just like grin coming up, and this is the most adorable thing about these little cuties. Now one day, the daughter woke up from her sleep and started nursing, and mom noticed immediately that there was none of that connection there. There was no visible sign of any kind of recognition coming from her. There was no scanning of the face. There was no eye contact. There was just flat affect, basically nobody home. And mom immediately, panicked, realized that something's going on. And the pediatrician pulled out the ophthalmoscope, the big eye scope, and looked right in the eye and didn't see anything, and couldn't figure out why all of a sudden normal baby would be just seemingly blind. So they then the pediatrician called up to the hospital, the big teaching hospital here in Portland, where they have a pediatric neuro-ophthalmologist. About that for a number of syllables. So they got her right up to the hospital, right to the front of the line, and this doctor pulled out the bigger eye scope. The doctor looked in her eye, and he wasn't sure. And as the report goes, he said, maybe there's an underdeveloped nerve there, the nerve that allows the brain to get the information into the eyeball and process all of that. Maybe that's underdeveloped, but I didn't see anything that was obvious going on. So we went through the rest of his differential diagnosis, the list of could-bes, what could be going on, and ruled them all out and came to, I guess, the end of the list, which would be maybe there's a tumor, maybe there's something going on in the brain that we can't see. So they ordered an MRI, and if you've been in that MRI machine, you're supposed to lie there just perfectly still, and good luck being a 2-month-old lying there perfectly still. So they had to immobilize her and do the scan of her whole brain. And again, so the story goes as the doctors wouldn't have been surprised had they seen something on that MRI. And turns out they didn't. They didn't see a darn thing on the MRI. And it left them with just, a very caring and humble shrug. Like, we don't know. We don't know what's going on. No, it's not right. And this is severe, but we don't know what we can do because we can't find something that's wrong. She's just not, for some reason, neurologically processing the world.
They couldn't find anything in the testing that indicated and pointed to exactly what was wrong.
That's it. I took a look at her and saw the same thing that they were very concerned about, is there was just it seemed to be like nobody home in there. So I pulled out my high-tech test, and I say that a bit humorously because what mine is the one that gave me the most information. So I basically picked her up upside down and held her by her legs. So she was upside down, and I watched how her body moved in response to being upside down. And after watching her, what I noticed was there was some kind of block or interference or twist or torsion, something going on right here where the skull sits on the top of the spine. And where the skull sits on the top of the spine is where the brain transitions down to brainstem, transitions into the spinal cord, where all the information from the whole body and a lot of the organs, in the head that tell the brain what's happening in the world, a lot of that brain processing happens right here at the base of the skull. And you have a twist or something going on, inflammation or a twist or a pulling, oftentimes there can be a real serious processing problem with the brain. I worked with her, and somewhere in that next 5 minutes, we saw almost like a cloud had been floated up off of my head, and she focused in, and immediately there was a recognition of person, and baby came and focused. And mom was here, dad was here, and I was here, like, oh, look, there she is. She just floated back up, and about 4 to 5 seconds later, she floated back off, almost as though, going underwater, into that same disconnected state again.
Well, explain what happened how did you get her connected, and then what happened where she went disconnected again?
What I was working with specifically is the part of her neurology And the nerves and the muscles and the sensory organ in there that senses where she is in space, that then moves the spine on its own, just like I have here in my fingers, right? I don't have to reach over with my other hand and move my hand because there's a sensory organ, there's a programming that moves my fingers. So when the brain can know just where my fingers are in space, it will do a great job at coordinating and aligning all of the bones in my fingers. And so very similarly, I was working with that part of the brain that senses where the skull and spinal cord are in space. And
how do you get the brain to sense that and trigger that? What are you doing to make that happen?
Yeah, so good question. The nerves, so that gets into energy and information moving up and down through the nerves, right? The brain constantly has to have a clear picture as to what's happening in the body at all times. And the way that it keeps a clear picture is it relies on a consistent flow of energy and information coming up through the nerves. And just like a garden hose, if you pinch the hose, then the energy and information doesn't flow. Okay? So if you pinch a nerve, the same thing that happens. If you pinch the nerve or stretch the nerve, the brain doesn't get adequate information from that part of the body. So then what happens? The body contorts or twists. And the brain does the best job it can with limited information. So based on my assessment of where the bones were, what the muscles were doing, where the skull was, where it was moving, where it wasn't moving, I figured out which nerves were not getting proper information to the brain. So I started stimulating those nerves to help the brain get more clarity.
How do you stimulate the nerves?
Some of these nerves are exquisitely sensitive to light touch, just like maybe your eyeball. If you were to touch your eyeball, you wouldn't have to touch it very hard in order to experience a full body reaction or reflex. All right, so my very light touches to very specific parts of that brainstem area, they can trigger what would be like a reflex. You know, when a doctor taps under your knee and the whole leg kicks out, if they get it in just the right spot. So if my touch was in just the right spot, a little reflex to move the body in one way or the other would actually open up that channel for the information to come through. So that's how the information would come through. But it's not like the bone is out of place that I just tapped back into place, because that would be a problem where something's broken and now it's fixed. But in reality, it's more like you're watching a kid learn to ride a bike and you're walking alongside her, and just with your hand on her back, she's using a little bit of your support in order to help this really complex mechanism learn to ride a little bit more reliably on its own, which is what we want. We want the brain and neurology to feel everything that's happening in the body on its own. So you
don't want to just hold the handlebars, because then the kid's not going to learn how to actually ride the bicycle.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And that's where a lot of us doctors end up having to do too much, is trying to hold the handlebars, is hold something in place. And it's not, it can be the response to maybe a confused view of how miraculously self-healing the body can be. So my question is, with her and everybody else that I work with, is what's the least amount that I have to do to help the body feel itself and heal itself? Right? And which is the same thing that we learn growing up when mom or dad are there holding the bottom of the bike seat, right? When we're learning to ride, they're barely holding on. And at some point we're riding along, focusing on everything else. We turn around there and mom's 20 feet behind us and we somehow mysteriously learn to do it ourselves. Right? And the spinal cord and nervous system transmitting that energy and information up and down to the brain functions the same way in a very coordinated and evolving capacity as we move through life.
So basically what you're doing is a little bit of tapping, a little bit of gentle suggestion for the nerves to trigger in the right way so that the spine can help realign and create that communication pathway.
Exactly.
What do you think happened that made her contract again?
Yeah, great. So I think, back to the bicycle analogy, you're walking along and something happened, the day before, whether it was she fell over, while she was sitting up, and maybe she knocked her head, or even in the middle of the night, who knows. But the nature of where the skull sits on top of that top spine bone, there's no real solid joint there. It's all muscles holding it in place. And so with the baby has this big, humongous head compared to this little tiny bone. So it's really easy to knock slightly out of alignment. And when you knock that out of alignment, the brain sometimes isn't skilled enough to bring it right back into place. So as I imagine it, my fingers are tapping or holding in just the right spot, allowed that information, as you said, the information to get through. And so the brain to then get a more clear picture as to, oh, this is where I am in space. This is how I actually process the information coming from the eyes. It's kind of it was an interesting thing to have happen. Was, something in here was, for some reason, made the brain confused about the information coming from the eyes. So I imagine what it was that I did was I helped the brain and the neurology figure out how to process information better. And something about maybe had she knocked her head the night before still needed to be worked on a few more times before it could actually ride its own spinal bike, if you will. And so by the time the end of the following week, I'd worked with her 3 or 4 more times. And by the end of that week, she was seeing with very little sign of receding into the background. And now she's a almost 5-year-old, bright, shiny, spunky little girl who's driving her 2 older brothers around the house.
Yeah. Did they go back to the doctors at all and show what happened? What was their response to that change?
Well, the doctors were excited, of course. It was, fantastic. And and kind of like me, they couldn't explain it. And because they couldn't explain what was wrong, then they didn't really have a narrative to put the results that we saw, into any kind of, story that may have made sense. Now, that being said, a lot of what I did is actually performed regularly by pediatricians over in Europe, where they check babies, and they check especially this very critically unstable part.
Where the head meets the neck.
Yeah. And that's just something that's standard protocol over there. And there's a Dr. Heiner Biederman that wrote a whole book on it. And they actually named this condition. It's called the KISS syndrome. It's a kinematic, so there's going to be some big words, kinematic insufficiency due to suboccipital strain. Kinematic motion, insufficiency being insufficiency due to suboccipital, which is right here, the base of the brain, strain, the strain of the muscle. Because of that area being so reliant on a very well coordinated, neurology, that it can be very susceptible to a little knock in one way or the other, including a traumatic birth sometimes.
Yeah. This is something you regularly see, is shifts in people, not just in how their physical body works, but in how other aspects of themselves work. I should say, not just the mechanical part of the body, right? But you got this baby to be alert, responsive, looking around, expressing emotion. What are some of the other things that you see as results from the network chiropractic work that you do?
That reminds me of a patient that started here in this last year, and he was in his 60s with a lot of low back pain, and And I remember talking to him during his intake, hearing all the things that happened to him, and we sent him off for x-rays and had some real severe scoliosis, which is a curvature of the spine, and a lot of associated degeneration in the spine where the bones start to fuse together. And I look at the spine as its own organ. Its own organ that moves, and it's charged with the protection of that lower brain. Mm-hmm. The upper brain is the part that's the blob that's up here in the skull, and it's completely encased by bone, right? And then the lower brain, where it transitions down from the brainstem, spinal cord, that goes all the way down and connects in our tailbone. And when I see areas where the spine's actually starting to fuse, you can start to see where the body's and the spinal cord has been protected mm-hmm. For a long time, oftentimes. What I see in one of my questions is for people is, if that's how the brain has been functioning in a state of that fight or flight or defense or rigidity, mm-hmm. oftentimes, the brain doesn't just work with how the body functions or the organ functions, but it's also an organ that moves emotion, right? Mm-hmm. It moves emotion through the nerves, and mm-hmm. that same nerve area may move sensation. And it may also help the brain process thought. Mm-hmm. And when you have an area where the body may be stuck in that fight or flight or defense because of some kind of trauma in the past, whether it's physical or emotional or chemical, those are the three main ways the body will experience trauma. And then every time the body protects itself, mm-hmm. which is a brilliant short-term strategy, right? Brilliant. You got to have it. You got to have it online. You got to have it ready. You got to have it ready to go and protect that part of you that processes the world and feels and thinks. And once it comes back out of that defense pattern, that fight or flight pattern, mm-hmm. you can move back on, towards life, why you're here, what you're doing, what you're bringing to the world, what your gifts are. Mm-hmm. But all of those, why you're here, what you're doing, what your gifts are, all of those get put aside when you're trying to survive. So oftentimes there will be a change in people's quality of life when there's been a trauma in the past. Now I'm going to loop that back around to this gentleman that started here in this last 6 months, because he also had, well, not complete flat affect like the little 2-month-old, but he was edgy, angry, mm-hmm. defensive. He wanted to understand everything scientifically, how it was going to work, how it was going to get better, how long it's going to take, how am I going to know if this is working? At what point, if I spent enough money, where do I need to go, right? He needed to have a lot of information so he could stay protected, because that's how the brain functions. Mm-hmm. Wants to stay protected. Mm-hmm. Now, he pulled me aside about 3 weeks after we started. And he looked at me and he said, "Dr. Walker, you didn't tell me the whole story about what you're doing here." You didn't tell me the whole story. And then he started to tell me about this trauma. Oh, I'm getting choked up now just thinking about it. This trauma that he had when he was a boy, where he'd been sent away. He's a young boy sent away to a summer camp by his mom, and how he felt like he'd been kicked out of his family. The one person that he could rely on, that loved him, relied on for support, that he was so connected to, sent him away. And what he did, and he's realizing this now, 65 years later, was what he did back then was he protected himself. Mm-hmm. Now the world is unsafe. The mm-hmm. one person I have here that's going to keep me safe, that I have to rely on to actually help raise me, that one person I have to rely on just took me out the front door and left for months on end. And he realized that his mental picture got into, how am I going to deal? How am I going to keep myself protected, because I'm all I got? And so he built a framework mm-hmm. that would keep him protected. He built a framework, the mental framework, sorry, I'm talking with my hands here again, that would keep him protected. Mm-hmm. And what this gentleman said to me again, that 3 weeks later, was he then came up and he had this gleam in his eye, that one that the little 2-month-old didn't have and then did have, and that the something-year-old didn't have and now has. Said, here's what's happening in this office, Dr. Walker. You're bringing people back to life. I didn't know that I was encased. I didn't know that I was so defensive. I didn't know, like, what have I lost this last 60 some years of my life? And now I have it back.